Some of those basic facts involve learning some basic biology, but I promise that even if you don't have a biology or chemistry background, everything I'm about to say should be accessible and clear to you. The important thing to know is that your brain and your spinal cord and the rest of your so-called nervous system control all the organs of your body, and that all the organs of your body feed back, meaning they communicate through chemicals and other means to your nervous system. Now, your nervous system plays a particularly important role in generating everything from sleep to wakefulness, creativity, stress, calm, etc., by way of a particular type of cell-cell interaction, and that's called synaptic communication. What is synaptic communication? Well, in order to understand that, let's dial back a little bit further and try and understand for a moment what makes up your nervous system. In its simplest form, your nervous system is made of nerve cells that we call neurons. Neurons communicate with one another through chemicals. They release certain chemicals that make other neurons more or less likely to be electrically active. What do we mean by electrically active? We mean, as it sounds, electricity passing down through cells and then literally causing electricity in other cells. The simplest way to think about this is maybe when you were a kid, or maybe even still now, you would wear socks and you'd shuffle along the floor to generate some static electricity, and then you'd touch someone and you'd shock them with your finger. I'm a younger brother, so I'd occasionally do that to my sister. I had friends, we would do that to one another. I know it's kind of silly and childish, yet it illustrates the principle that we can generate electricity and pass electricity to other beings, or in the case of neurons, from one neuron to the next. The way neurons do that is that in between the neurons, there are little spaces. Those little spaces are called synapses. And neurons literally vomit. Well, they don't literally vomit, but they release little packets of so-called transmitter chemical into that space we call a synapse. It travels across the synapse. It attaches to the cell on the other side, the other neuron. And then depending on what that chemical is, it either makes that next neuron more electrically active or less electrically active, so-called excitation. It either excites the next neuron to be electrically active also, or it inhibits, it prevents the next neuron from being electrically active. So again, very simply, we have nerve cells that communicate with one another through electricity and chemicals that inspire that electricity, and the little gaps between neurons are called synapses. If you can understand that, I'm certain you can make it through the rest of the episode and that you will get all the depth and important detail that you need to know. But I want to go just a little bit further and explain that neurons don't just talk one-to-one. There are trillions of neurons in your nervous system that allow you to be happy, to be in love, to be sad, to be in grief, to remember things, and so on. And what you do at any moment, what you feel and what you think, relates to which so-called neural circuits are active. So a lot of times we think about brain areas, and we've all seen these pictures of the brain where, someone was in a fMRI scanner or they were in a brain scanner of some sort, and they saw a picture of something and a certain area of the brain lights up, as it's called. That lighting up of the brain really reflects the activity of hundreds, if not thousands, maybe even millions of neurons in that region. Those images of brain areas lighting up, and indeed talking about brain areas lighting up, can be a little bit or a lot misleading because, in fact, no single brain area controls any one single perception or behavior or feeling state. Rather, we have so-called neural circuits, chains of neurons, chains of specific neurons, that is, that create different states of mind, that lead to specific behaviors, that lead to specific emotional states. And those neural circuits are made up of lots of different brain areas that light up in particular sequences. And when I say light up, what I mean is that particular brain areas either excite or prevent the excitation, that is, they inhibit other brain areas in a particular sequence. Much like keys on a piano played in a particular sequence makes up a particular song, particular brain areas activated or made silent in a particular sequence leads to a particular behavior, like getting up out of a chair, or a particular feeling state, like being particularly happy one day when you wake up, or particularly depressed, whether or not that depression is caused by a life event or whether or not it arises spontaneously. So we have neurons, we have synapses, and we have neural circuits. And vitally important is the fact that which neural circuits are active and which neural circuits are likely to be less active at any given moment depends on two major categories of chemicals. It depends on hormones and it depends on so-called neuromodulators. Now, we're mainly going to focus on neuromodulators today because those are the things that if you can learn to control them, and indeed there are tools to control them, then you can control which neural circuits are more likely or less likely to be active in you at any given moment. And in doing so, you can control whether or not you are going to be alert and focused or deeply asleep. You can control whether or not you are going to be in a creative state or whether or not you're going to be in a state of mind more fit, more capable, that is, of doing focused work or math or more so-called linear types of work where there's a correct answer. There's a specific thing to follow and you're simply going to plug and chug, as it were, through a particular set of steps in order to accomplish something. Or, for instance, whether or not you're going to be in a more relaxed and creative state where you're thinking about new ideas or new ideas are just seem to be spontaneously coming to mind. All of that can be controlled to a considerable extent by leveraging these so-called neuromodulators. What are neuromodulators? Neuromodulators are particular chemicals that make it likely that certain neural circuits will be active and not others. And the four neuromodulators that we're going to talk about today that are of the utmost importance for your goals are dopamine, epinephrine, also called adrenaline, serotonin, and acetylcholine. That's dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine. Today, I'm going to teach you how each of those different categories of neuromodulators work and the things that you can do to control those neuromodulators, that is, increase them or decrease them through behavioral tools and supplementation in ways that allow you to access the brain and body states that you want at the times that you want. Just very quickly, I want to talk about how neuromodulators are able to work, regardless of whether or not it's dopamine or serotonin or epinephrine, etc. There are many features of how neuromodulators work, but for sake of today's discussion, we only need to focus on two of those features, and those are fast-acting features and longer, slower features, or what we call baseline features. What am I talking about when I say faster or baseline? Well, consider that at any given moment, whether or not you're asleep or awake, whether or not it's morning or afternoon or night, you have some amount of dopamine being released in your brain and body, some amount of serotonin, some amount of epinephrine, and some amount of acetylcholine. It is rarely, if ever, the case that you have zero dopamine or zero serotonin. So often we hear about someone being dopamine depleted, or these days you hear a lot about that anyways. Or you'll hear that people's serotonin is bottomed out. In reality, none of these neuromodulators ever disappear completely, but they tend to be present at different levels or different relative levels. Another important thing to point out is that they don't work alone. In fact, as you'll soon learn, dopamine and epinephrine are close cousins that collaborate in terms of creating states of focus and motivation, for instance, or in creating states of energy and the pursuit of particular goals. When I say they're close cousins, what I mean is that they tend to impact some of the same neural circuits. And believe it or not, dopamine and epinephrine are chemically related too. I'll just tell you right now that epinephrine is actually derived from dopamine. Chemically, epinephrine, that is adrenaline, is made from the molecule dopamine. Now, dopamine and serotonin can also work together to impact certain circuits in the brain, but in large part, they operate on separate circuits. And acetylcholine, which you'll soon learn is involved in states of focus and can actually open up. It can literally create states in the mind in which your brain is more plastic and able to change and learn more quickly. Well, acetylcholine can do that on its own, but rarely does it do it on its own. More typically, it gets assistance from some of the other neuromodulators. Now, that might seem like it complicates the picture, but it actually makes the picture far simpler, because what we can say for sure is that the fast actions of dopamine or the fast actions of epinephrine, serotonin, or acetylcholine are actions that occur on the order of seconds or minutes or up to about an hour or so. whereas the slower actions of those neuromodulators tend to occur on the order of hours, days, or even weeks. Now, perhaps surprisingly, I'd like to focus on the slow actions of the neuromodulators first, because those slow actions of the neuromodulators are happening in you and in me and in everyone right now, and they set the backdrop, the context in which the various tools to manipulate dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, or acetylcholine will work. What do I mean by the context or the backdrop or the baseline? Well, it's fair to say that most people are awake during the daytime and asleep at night. I do realize that there are people who are going to be doing shift work, or they're raising young children, or that might have a sick person at home that they're tending to, et cetera, or even have insomnia, they're tending to them. So schedules of sleep and wakefulness will vary, but in general, everybody, regardless of whether or not you're nocturnal or you're so-called diurnal, you're awake during the day, pretty much everybody follows a schedule in which from 0 to 9 hours after waking, that is from the time you wake up until about 9 hours later, the neuromodulators dopamine and epinephrine tend to be at their highest levels that they will be at any point in the 24-hour period, in any period of the day. So we can call this 0 to 9 hour period phase 1 of the day, just for simplicity. And I've referred to this before in a previous episode, but not in this exact context. From 9 to about 16 hours is what we will call phase 2, and that's when dopamine and epinephrine levels tend to subside a bit compared to the earlier phase 1 part of the day, and serotonin levels start to increase. And then phase 3 of the 24-hour cycle, which is from about, and again, about, these are approximates, from about 17 hours after waking until about 24 hours after waking, is phase 3 of the day. And during that time, there is chaos in terms of which neuromodulators are most present in the brain. And by chaos, what I mean is that during sleep, you have incredible peaks in acetylcholine and drops in acetylcholine. You have incredible peaks in dopamine and drops in dopamine. You have incredible peaks in serotonin and drops in serotonin. Most often, you are not going to see much, if any, release of epinephrine, adrenaline. And that's because epinephrine, also called adrenaline, tends to wake us up and put us into action mode behaviors. And that's simply not happening during sleep. But for the other three neuromodulators, across the night, it's sort of chaos. You've got peaks and drops in different combinations than you would ever see in wakefulness. And this plays important roles in dreaming, important roles in some of the reparative functions of sleep. The point is that during that phase 3, the levels of neuromodulators are all over the place, but it's not random, right? I say it's chaos, but it's organized according to the specific reparative goals of sleep, the specific metabolic roles of sleep, et cetera. We're not going to focus too much on phase 3 today, because phase 3 of the 24-hour cycle, that 17 to 24-hour period, is one in which you ought to be deeply asleep, whether or not you're nocturnal or diurnal, right? 17 hours after waking, you ought to be asleep. And there are a lot of episodes of this podcast, and indeed today I started talking about 2 particular studies related to sleep. There are a lot of tools to enhance sleep, et cetera. And of course, there are things that you can do in the late portion of phase 2 of the day in order to enhance your transition time into and depth of sleep. But you can't really do much during sleep, right? You're not taking supplements. You're not doing breathing practices. There are things to fall back asleep, but you're not really doing much during sleep. So we're mainly going to focus on what we're calling phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 being this dopamine, epinephrine-dominated phase of our day, and phase 2 being this more serotonergic or serotonin-dominated portion of the day. And then you might say, well, what about acetylcholine? Forgot about acetylcholine. Well, we didn't forget about acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is under control more in terms of what we happen to be doing at any given moment, whether or not we're focusing or not focusing, whether or not we're learning or not learning. And here I'm referring to acetylcholine specifically in the context of the brain and thinking, because as some of you are probably shouting out there, right? If you're exercise physiologists or you know anything about how the brain controls movement, acetylcholine is used at the nerve to muscle synapse, right? So neurons don't just control other neurons electrically. The way you are able to move, in fact, is because neurons are controlling the electric activity of muscles literally the contraction of muscle fibers, and that control is exerted through the release of acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is working at muscles as well, but we're not focused on that today. We're focused on what we can do during phase 1 of the day and what we can do during phase 2 of the day to control the specific neuromodulators, dopamine, epinephrine, serotonin, and acetylcholine toward particular end goals. And as I've been harping on for the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, it is important to understand that in the early phase 1 part of the day, again, 0 to 9 hours, dopamine and epinephrine already dominate the neuromodulator landscape. That is, they are already elevated, and then they will taper off in phase 2. Whereas in phase 2 of the day, serotonin tends to dominate more than dopamine and epinephrine. And so if you think about that, what it means is that if your goal is to increase serotonin in order to get some particular effect on your mental performance or physical performance or health, or if your goal is to increase your dopamine or epinephrine to get some particular effect on your mental health, physical performance, etc., well, then you need to consider what the background level of dopamine or epinephrine or serotonin happens to be. Because in doing so, you will know which tool to select and how hard you need to push on that tool, right? If your levels of dopamine are already riding pretty high because it's the early part of the day, well, then it doesn't take a whole lot more to get dopamine to a level in which it can, for instance, change your level of motivation. Whereas if you're in the late part of the day, let's say 8 or 9 p.m., and you have a lot of serotonin swimming around in your system, and you really need to be focused and alert, well, you can do that by leveraging the dopamine and epinephrine system, and indeed the acetylcholine system too. But you're going to have to resort to tools that can do that far more potently and that can do that in a much more sustained way if you're going to access the state that you want. So again, it's really important to understand what the backdrop of these neuromodulators is, the so-called baseline, and that they vary across the day if you are going to be able to leverage tools to optimize your brain chemistry. Anyone that tells you, do this protocol in order to increase your dopamine, do this protocol or take this supplement to increase your serotonin, they can be telling you the absolute truth. But if you don't consider the backdrop over which that supplement or behavior is going to have its effect, well, then you can't really predict the effect it will have. But if you can understand these backdrop baseline elements to how neuromodulators work, well, then you're in a terrific position to leverage the best tools in the immediate and short term, and that is on the order of seconds, minutes, and hours. Before we dive into the more pointed, directed effects of specific tools on neuromodulators, I'd like to just briefly mention hormones because they are also important for understanding the background and the context and these baseline levels of neuromodulators. Now, here I'm going to paint with a bit of a broad brush, but what I will say is accurate, even though it might not be exhaustive. What I mean by that is everything I'm about to say is true, but it doesn't cover every example in detail and nuanced possibility out there. Hormones have many different effects on the brain and body, and not unlike neuromodulators, some of those effects are very fast, some of them are very slow. In fact, certain hormones, for instance, the steroid hormones like estrogen and like testosterone and corticosteroids, and here, of course, I'm referring to the steroid hormones for what they are. They are indeed steroid hormones, but I'm not talking about steroids that people inject for sports performance or for physical augmentation. I'm talking about the steroid hormones that you make naturally, because indeed you make these naturally. Well, the steroid hormones can actually control gene expression. They can change the identity of cells and the genes and proteins that cells express. This is why during puberty, for instance, testosterone and estrogen are released into the body, growth hormone is released into the body, and bodies and voices and personalities and brains change tremendously because literally there is a transformation of the breast tissue, of the testicular tissue, of the ovarian tissue, of the bones, of the muscles, of the tissues and cells that control hair growth. Gene expression changes in all those cell types, and the child becomes an adolescent, becomes a young adult, right? That's what puberty really is. In fact, puberty is perhaps the most dramatic transformation that we go through in our entire lifespan in terms of our aging, because indeed it reflects a very rapid, I should mention, period of aging, and transformation of the identity of cells. So steroid hormones and other hormones can have very slow, long-lasting actions in that way. They can also have very fast actions. So for instance, adrenaline, epinephrine, released from the adrenal glands can immediately make your heart beat faster, can immediately change the circumference of your blood vessels and arteries and capillaries and change the way blood flows. It can change the way you see the world, literally. It does change the way you see the world through your visual system. And that all happens on the order of hundreds of milliseconds or seconds. These are extremely fast actions. Corticosteroid also can have fast actions and slow actions. But since this isn't a discussion about hormones per se, and we've done entire episodes like the Optimize Testosterone and Estrogen episode. You can find that at hubermanlab.com, or the interview with the incredibly knowledgeable and clear and really wonderful tutor of actionable information, Dr. Kyle Gillette, who is also on this podcast. You can learn a lot about hormones there. Today, we want to think about hormones as they relate to these neuromodulators, the dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, and acetylcholine. And in general, testosterone tends to collaborate with and increase the action of dopamine. That's not always the case, but in general, when testosterone goes up, dopamine goes up. And sometimes even vice versa. When dopamine goes up, testosterone go up. And this is true for both males and for females. In general, when corticosteroids like cortisol and some related steroid hormones increase, epinephrine levels go up. And in general, when hormones like oxytocin or prolactin are increased, levels of serotonin go up. We can't draw a direct link between any one hormone system and acetylcholine. Acetylcholine kind of sits off in a category of its own in that way. But again, in general, testosterone and dopamine tend to collaborate in the same direction. Cortisol and epinephrine tend to collaborate in the same direction. Oxytocin and prolactin, which are hormones, and serotonin tend to collaborate in the same direction. And then we have poor old lonely acetylcholine off on its own. But it's not poor and lonely. It actually has incredibly potent effects on its own. So it's really that it just doesn't need much help from the hormone systems, or at least not the steroid hormone systems, in order to have its tremendous effects. Now, a lot of what people think about and will do when trying to improve mental health and physical health is they will try and increase or decrease certain categories of hormones of the sort that I mentioned: testosterone, estrogen, oxytocin, prolactin, so on. But oftentimes, the effects of those manipulations in hormones that are going to be most salient are not going to be due to the direct effects of those hormones. Sometimes it could be, but oftentimes it's going to be due to their effects on the brain and nervous system by way of how those hormones impact neuromodulators. So for instance, there are various things that people can do, both men and women, to increase their testosterone and estrogen in the appropriate ratios. I talked about one such approach in a previous episode, and that is to get sunlight onto a large portion of one's skin each day. Believe it or not, this actually works. And it works because your skin is actually an endocrine organ, a hormone secreting organ. It's a beautiful study. I've covered it on this podcast before. We will provide a link to this study again, but it had people spend at least 20 minutes or so, closer to 30 minutes each day, trying to maximize sunlight exposure to as much of their skin as they could in terms of still maintaining decent exposure, meaning not overexposing themselves in a cultural way, meaning wearing enough clothes that they were decent, but still getting a lot of sun exposure a couple of times per week or more. What they found was that people's testosterone and estrogen levels went up, feelings of well-being went up, feelings of increases in libido were observed as well. They subjectively reported more passion, etc. Testosterone and estrogen did indeed both go up. And again, I want to highlight that increases in estrogen, not just testosterone, are related to increases in libido in both men and women. This is why you never want to crush your estrogen down to zero, whether or not you're male or female, if you want to maintain some sort of healthy libido and general feelings of well-being unrelated to libido. Well, many of those effects we know are not due to direct effects of testosterone and estrogen, but rather are due to the effects of testosterone and estrogen on the neuromodulators, dopamine and serotonin. because much of libido and feelings of well-being and feelings of relaxation, but also desire, motivation, etc., originate because of the activation of neural circuits that dopamine controls and promotes, and that serotonin promote and control. So this is very important to understand as we move toward more specific discussion of the chemicals that we call neuromodulators, because hormones are controlling those neuromodulators in a very slow modulatory way. So yes, I said it. Hormones modulate neuromodulators. I sort of said it twice on purpose. And this is a dramatic and potent effect. So I'll just give you one more example. The hormone prolactin tends to be antagonistic. It tends to reduce amounts of dopamine, or at least when prolactin levels are high, dopamine levels tend to be lower. You observe this after the birth of a new child. You observe this postcoitally after mating in all species, humans and animals. When prolactin is elevated, serotonin tends to be elevated. And when prolactin is elevated, levels of dopamine and the effects of dopamine tend to subside. Now, as I move toward explaining what each of the four categories of neuromodulators do, this will start to make more and more sense as to why this would be. I always say I wasn't consulted at the design phase, meaning I didn't design these circuits. And if anyone tells you that they did, you should back away quickly, because none of us design these circuits. This is the way that evolution and nature created these systems. And they tend to work in a bit of a seesaw fashion. Prolactin up, dopamine down, right? Dopamine up, prolactin down. In general, that is the way they work. So if we are to take a look at how each of these neuromodulator systems functions on its own, while understanding that they never truly function on their own, we can start to really make sense of the landscape of tools that are available to us and which tools are going to be most powerful to select if our goal is, for instance, to be focused, or if our goal is to be less stressed, or if our goal is to be highly motivated and highly focused for sake of learning. All of that is indeed possible if you understand these four neuromodulators and you understand that while there are many tools ranging from pharmacologic to behavioral that can tap into these neuromodulator systems that can kind of press on the gas of dopamine, pull back on serotonin, and so on, but that there are particular tools, both behavioral and supplementation-based, and to some extent prescription drug-based too, and we'll touch on a few of those. If you understand that and why they work, well, then you can create a sort of kit, a grab bag of things that you can use in any context, or I should say that you can look to depending on the context you're in, and create the states of body and mind that you want. Now, once again, painting with a somewhat broad brush, but nonetheless an accurate brush, we can say that dopamine, when elevated above baseline, tends to increase states of motivation, both mental and physical motivation, drive, and to some extent, focus. I've said it many times before, and I'll say it again. There's a lot of misconception about dopamine. Many people out there think that dopamine is all about pleasure. You hear about dopamine hits or people chasing dopamine or the need to have a dopamine fast, etc. Dopamine is not about pleasure. Dopamine is about motivation, craving, and pursuit for goals or for things that are outside our immediate possession and experience. The motivation and pursuit of a mate, the motivation and pursuit to mate, the motivation and pursuit of food, the motivation and pursuit of a career goal, et cetera, et cetera. Things we do not yet have, but that we want, and we get into sort of a forward center of mass and a pursuit of, and that pursuit can be physical, that pursuit can be cognitive, it can be both cognitive and physical, and it can involve talking about something, right? Because in some professions, pursuit of things involves talking. I think about lawyers, they talk a lot in pursuit of winning cases and money, et cetera, putting people in jail or keeping people out of jail, et cetera. That's done with their mouths, not with their bodies. Athletes in a state of motivated training or in motivated competition use their bodies. Which, all this is obvious, of course, but perhaps what is not so obvious is that one molecule, not working alone, but predominantly one molecule, dopamine, is responsible for all of those motivated states, which again underscores the power of these neuromodulators. So dopamine we can think of, at least in the context of today's discussion, as controlling and indeed promoting motivation, drive, and pursuit, and to some extent, focus. Epinephrine and a closely related molecule called norepinephrine, and again, I want to emphasize that epinephrine is adrenaline and adrenaline is epinephrine. Norepinephrine is noradrenaline and noradrenaline is norepinephrine, but today we're going to just simply talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine. That category of neuromodulator is mainly responsible for generating our energy, our level of fuel and baseline level of forward center of mass, as I like to call it. You can also think of it as how high your RPM are. Now, we're not a car, and the car analogy sort of falls apart as we go further into the biology, but it's a decent one for now. When epinephrine levels are high, we tend to feel agitated. We tend to feel like we want to move. We tend to feel like we can't shut down our thinking and our anticipation of what's going to happen next. And when epinephrine levels are very, very low, we actually have less physical energy. We tend to have less mental energy in terms of generating thoughts very quickly, and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned before, dopamine and epinephrine are closely related, so much so that we know for a fact that epinephrine is actually manufactured from the molecule dopamine. So that's why I'm talking about these two neuromodulators in very close juxtaposition, because they do indeed collaborate with one another. But for sake of today's discussion, we can just think of epinephrine as increasing energy. Adrenaline increases energy and our state of readiness. It also, I should mention, activates our immune system. Contrary to popular belief that stress inhibits our immune system, epinephrine is deployed, it's released at great levels in our brain and body when we are stressed, and that actually protects us against infections of multiple kinds, at least in the short term. That and all the details of that and tools related to that were covered in our episode on the immune system, if you want to check that out. Now, the neuromodulator serotonin creates a number of different states in the brain and body, but for sake of today's discussion, we're going to think about the predominant states that it creates, and those are states of contentness, being happy, feeling fairly relaxed, feeling soothed, and to some extent, even some relief from pain or lack of pain. Serotonin is associated with a feeling of satiety, of having enough of what we already have. Now, when serotonin is very, very high, people can even be sedate. They can be completely amotivated, no motivation to seek out things like food or sex or work, or et cetera. Whereas when serotonin levels are very low, people can actually exhibit agitation and high levels of stress. So the levels matter here, but again, for sake of today's conversation, when we leverage serotonin, we are really leveraging a neuromodulator that tends to increase the activity of neural circuits in the brain and body that make us feel relaxed and happy. And it tends to decrease the activity of neural circuits that make us rabidly in pursuit of things that we don't have, right? The opposite of content and sated is motivation, desire, and hunger and thirst for things that we don't have. So serotonin is the molecule of peace. It is the molecule of contentness. It is the molecule of having enough, at least for the time being, or the feeling that we have enough for the time being. Now, acetylcholine is a fourth category of neuromodulator that, as I mentioned earlier, is somewhat, not totally, but somewhat distinct from any direct control by the major hormone systems of the body, or at least the major steroid hormone systems. And acetylcholine, we can say, is mainly associated with states of focus. And we can go a step further and say that it's mainly associated with steps of focus as they relate to learning and encoding new information, so-called neuroplasticity. Now, neuroplasticity, or the brain and nervous system's ability to change in response to experience, can be impacted by an enormous number of different chemicals, not just acetylcholine. But acetylcholine has a particularly potent ability to open up the thing that we call neuroplasticity, to allow plasticity to happen in one moment, whereas in a previous moment, it could not occur because acetylcholine had not been released in the brain or in the spinal cord. So acetylcholine is involved in focus and in learning, but it is not necessarily always associated with learning in the context of highly motivated, really ramped up states. It can be, but acetylcholine can also be released and can encourage the learning and neuroplasticity associated with calm states. For instance, if somebody has a newborn child, we know that they are flooded with oxytocin, which has actually even been called the love hormone, although it does many things in addition to control feelings of romantic attachment and attachment to children, et cetera. It does all of that, but it does a lot more as well. But when people have a new child, they also tend to be hyper-focused on that child, not just its well-being, but they narrow all their thinking, all their vision, all their hearing to that child. And there are obvious adaptive reasons for wanting to do that. I recall a family dinner we had, this was over 10 years ago. We had a couple over. My mom was in the habit of inviting people over who didn't have places to go on the holidays because that's just who she is. And I think it's quite nice. So she brought over this couple. They had a newborn. I think this baby had been born maybe 2 or 3 weeks before, and it was not seated. It was lying down. It couldn't see it. It was like a potato bug. It could barely hold its head up. But it was lying in a little bassinet on the floor as we ate dinner. And it was almost hilarious. It actually was hilarious. We laughed a lot about this, that the entire meal, they were basically staring at this baby. They were so clearly in love with the baby and so flooded with oxytocin and also prolactin that they couldn't take their focus off this baby. It was actually really wonderful and endearing to see. But in addition to that, I'd be willing to bet, had I been able to do a little bit of microdialysis, which is an ability to measure the amounts of neuromodulator at a given location in the brain, had I been able to do that experiment on them, in that moment, I would have found that levels of acetylcholine were exceedingly high because they were so hyper-focused on this child, not just in love with, but focused on that child. And without a doubt, the neural circuits related to focus and plasticity were heavily engaged, again, for obvious adaptive reasons related to child rearing and learning the coos and cries and pain signals and pleasure signals of one's offspring. So we have dopamine associated with motivation, drive, and pursuit, and to some extent focus. We have epinephrine and norepinephrine associated with energy, of having a forward center of mass, mentally and or physically. We have serotonin, which is associated with a peaceful, content, sated state of being. And we have acetylcholine, which is associated with focus, and in particular focus as it relates to learning and encoding new information.